Right, good morning, everyone. So today we're getting to start chapter 5, which is all about consciousness. And this is going to be another one of those chapters where we're a little bit all over the board in terms of the textbook topics. And I just find that it's because this chapter is a lot of random information that ends up kind of tucked together. So I'm going to start with sort of a general overview of what is consciousness and how might we look at studying it. And then I'm going to look a little bit at attention simply because it carries over really nicely from our previous topic where we were talking about perception. And perception and attention go very much hand in hand. It is also my favorite of these topics for this chapter, so I wanted to do it as early as possible. But let's start off with our standard, what is consciousness? And this is another one of those very difficult to quantify kind of terms. So we can call it the awareness of internal and external stimuli. And you're going to find that we use consciousness and awareness kind of interchangeably as sort of definitions for one another without necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of what they mean. And that's not because we're trying to be difficult, but because most people can't agree on how best to quantify it. But if you find yourself in sort of a circular understanding of the two concepts, that's probably why. So with consciousness, this is our subjective awareness of both ourselves and our environment. So we can be conscious of what's going on internally. So maybe you're feeling hungry, so you're aware of that feeling internally. Or maybe you're a little bit cold because maybe the heat hasn't kicked on quite high enough for you. So that's something external that you are also aware of. And our awareness, the things that we are actively conscious of, can kind of shift. So we can be completely unaware of something in one moment, and then if our attention is directed, then we can become aware of it shortly thereafter. So I've done that a couple of times by talking about things like sensory adaptation, when I had mentioned that our skin is able to feel tactile stimulation. So when you put on your clothes in the morning, you feel the texture of your shirt and then ignore it. But if I draw your attention back to it now, you might be more aware of what you're wearing. So a lot of directed and sort of how we can shift your attention and your consciousness to different aspects. So if we want to talk about, okay, well, if consciousness is this vague concept, how can we describe it? And so we have a couple of terms that really help define what we mean when we say things that we are conscious or aware of. The first is that this is something that is subjective and private. So we come back to that idea of each individual is going to have their own subjective interpretation of a situation. So it's something that you know about yourself. You can make your own judgments, have your own awareness, and others won't necessarily understand or be able to connect to what you are aware of. So others cannot know our reality. So just looking at you, someone doesn't necessarily know if you are hungry or cold or if your shirt is soft. That's not something we know. We've also addressed the fact that consciousness is dynamic. So we are continually changing what we are or are not aware of at any given moment. And it's usually self-reflective. So our mind is aware of its own consciousness, so we can think about thinking. We can have these sort of meta discussions of what you are aware of being aware of. So it's something that we can be aware of within our own minds. So those are all accurate descriptors of consciousness and awareness, though I don't know that they've actually cleared up exactly what it is quite yet. So maybe let's look at how we might test for consciousness to give us an idea of sort of the substance of it. So there are a bunch of different ways to test for consciousness, but they are going to be a little bit, none of them are going to be ideal, is what we can say. There are pros and cons for each of them that come back to some of these issues of consciousness where it's subjective and private, which means that sometimes people can't tell us exactly what they're experiencing. It's dynamic, so it's changing all the time, so it's really hard to quantify. And it's self-reflective, so if you're not careful, drawing someone's attention to something can then change their awareness of it. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. So these are the best that we have in order to try and study consciousness, but aren't necessarily going to be perfect all at once. So the first are self-reports. So this is when you would ask people to describe their own inner experiences. This could be something like a Likert scale test, where they say, okay, there's a bunch of statements. How much do you agree or disagree with each of these statements as they relate to your own consciousness and awareness of the situation presently? So it allows us to have some direct insight into those subjective experiences if the participants are telling the truth. So we kind of have to assume that they're not lying to us. And we've talked in chapter 2 about some of the ways that we can get around that, maybe by framing a question in opposite directions and making sure that they agree with both sort of the forward version and the backward version appropriately. But yes, we do have to keep in mind that sometimes it is intentionally misleading, so maybe somebody doesn't want to admit to the fact that they're aware of something, or it could be unintentionally misleading. Maybe they don't understand the question, or maybe it isn't framed in a way that connects for them. So there's lots of ways that these self-reports can be problematic. We could go with a physiological study. So instead of relying on people to tell us what they're experiencing, we could look at a measure of something physiological about them. So this would be something like using an EEG to measure sleep stages, which we're going to see a lot of in this chapter because one of those sort of disconnected chunks is all about sleep. And this is great because when we are directly measuring bodily functions, they can't really interfere with it. The individual can't lie about what kind of sleep waves they have because it's just something that's happening. So it's an objective measure, so we get a hard measurement, but now we lose that sort of personal touch. We can see particular brain waves, but what does it mean? What are we associating it with? So we might have to pair it with a measure of self-report and accept that there might be some deception or not full truth or misleading questions and all of that if we wanted to tie the individual's experience to what we're measuring about their physiology. So again, pros and cons to each of these. And then the last one is a behavioral study. And this one is often the first thing that people will think about when testing consciousness in non-human animals, but this is also a really great way to test it in humans without necessarily giving them directions that might bias their behavior. But the most famous of the behavioral studies to try and test for consciousness is called the Rouge test. And this ties into sort of one of those bigger, debates within psychology. And this is the idea of a sense of self. So we might look at the term state of mind or, no, that's not the word. There's a term for it. I'm going to think of it in a second. I might not think of it in a second. It'll come to me in a minute. I'll come back to it when it gets there. But anyways, this is the idea that an individual has a sense of self and an idea that their consciousness is different from others. So when you get into 105 and start talking about development, and when children are very young, if they have knowledge, they assume that everyone has the same knowledge. But as they get older, they start to realize that they have separate experiences and everybody has their own unique consciousness. And for the longest time, theory of mind is the term. I saw state of mind on my slide and it kind of got in the way. But this theory of mind is the idea that we have awareness that our consciousness is different from others' consciousness, and others have their own sense of self that's different from who we are. So again, very abstract concepts, sticking with our consciousness topic for the chapter, but also a very controversial one because people had for a very long time assumed that humans were the only animals with theory of mind. They were the only ones who could have that acknowledgement that they know something that others don't. But a lot of more recent research in a lot of different species has started to show evidence of this awareness of self versus others. And a lot of this has come from behavioral studies. So the reason here is you can't sit a chimpanzee or a raven down and ask them, well, who are you and who is that? That just doesn't work. The same way you can't do that with a young child. So you have to design a setup where they can only perform a particular action if they have a concept of self. And so this is where our Rouge test comes in. So we have an image there of a chimpanzee, and it's really, really hard to see, but they've basically put a dot, a red dot, on his eyebrow, and they have him sitting in front of a mirror. And so the idea would be if you have a dog or a cat and they see a mirror, they usually get aggressive, they assume it's another dog or cat, and they want to attack it. But with theory of mind, these other animals should be able to recognize that what's in the mirror isn't another separate creature, it's actually themselves. And so we judge this awareness if they'll reach to their own forehead when they see that their reflection has that red dot. And so they do it with, obviously, control. So maybe they touch one chimpanzee's forehead but not put color, and they put color in different places and make sure that they're controlling for all of those different aspects. But they'd want to make sure that they'd recognize the reflection as their own. And so this has been done with chimpanzees. There's even some evidence that some fish can do this. Corvids, there's quite a few different species, which is really cool. And so this is why there's been a lot of push lately that maybe theory of mind isn't as human exclusive as we've always thought it is. But this is, again, one of those topics where if you bring it up at a conference, you can usually get the two sides of the argument really aggressive about it. So we just say that it's something that's ongoing, and it's a very difficult topic to quantify. So we don't really have a true answer, but it's something that's going to definitely be coming up. And so these behavioral studies are great because you don't have that sort of extra issue of language, so you can get humans to do this, and they don't even know what you're asking them because you haven't given them any instructions. We've done similar types of behavioral studies, getting humans to listen to sounds and categorize them in groups the same way that we would chickadees. So there's no risk of our instructions sort of biasing their behavior, but it's also great if you're working with species that don't have language. So we'll see a lot of behavioral studies almost exclusively with our non-human animals. All right, so those are a couple of different ways that we can try and get at some of the factors of consciousness. But you should by now have the idea that it's quite the complex topic. There's a lot of moving parts to it, and people are going to have a lot of different focuses. So some people, if they're studying sort of the functioning at the level of the brain, and they don't really care too much about what experiences go along with different kinds of brain waves, they might be okay with just those physiological tests. Or maybe they really want some kind of explanation, and they're going to get survey reports from people, so they can decide which one works for their particular research questions. And there are lots of different questions. But we're going to bring it back a little bit to some of our earlier perspectives. Again, bringing it back to our earlier chapters where we talked about different views of sort of humans and how we think and the role potentially of our mind. So now we get to add in just a little bit more detail. We're going to focus in on two major ones that really cared about consciousness. So if you remember, we had talked about our psychodynamic perspective and humanistic and cognitive and so on and so forth. Some of those really relied on the presence of consciousness and awareness, and others completely excluded the mind. So we're going to ignore the ones that didn't pay attention to the mind, so we won't see a ton of reference to our behaviorists, but we will talk a lot about our psychodynamic perspective and our cognitive perspective. So starting with psychodynamic perspective, as per always, when you see psychodynamic, you should always assume Freud. That's where this one started, but it isn't just Freudian concepts, and modern psychodynamic perspective is, again, quite removed from where it started from. But the core ideas here are that we have three different levels of consciousness. We have the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. So you could think of the conscious as everything that you are currently aware of. So if you're paying attention in lecture, that's the concepts that are coming into your head, and maybe you're making connections to other things that you already know. That's what's going on in your conscious. With your pre-conscious, those are events that are outside of your current awareness, but could easily be recalled. So we're talking about these different psychologists and different people, and I said, okay, well, we're going to ignore the behaviorists for the most part, so maybe that makes you think back to Skinner, who was a radical behaviorist. So you weren't actively thinking about Skinner in the moment, but you could easily recall that information because it's something you learned previously. Our unconscious is even further from our awareness. So this is something that isn't brought into conscious awareness, something that's very difficult to bring to our current attention. So our unconscious would be the things that Freud liked to focus on, those deep, dark, repressed concepts and theories and ideas. So a lot of what he focused on were things like sexual desire, aggression, things like that people would bury down. But the focus here, and the part that we care about into more modern times, is that the unconscious would be the stuff that we're not aware of and usually can't be made aware of. And usually textbooks, I didn't include this image for whatever reason, but usually textbooks will explain the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious in terms of an iceberg. And so the stuff that's above the water is your conscious. The stuff that's right at the water line would be the pre-conscious, stuff that could very easily rise above the water level, but is just sitting at the surface. And then the unconscious is all of this stuff that's deep down in the depths that doesn't ever see the light of day. So that might be a nice way to try and visualize those three factors. And of course, we can talk about some pros and cons here. It was nice, I guess, at the time for them to start considering things that we're not actively aware of, whether it be our pre-conscious, the stuff that could be brought to mind if we're directed that way. But, of course, our psychodynamic perspective was really focused in on the unconscious, the stuff that we weren't aware of, and drawing attention to that unconscious through what turned out to be some pretty controversial therapeutic methods. So this is a lot of repressed memory type work, getting into some hypnosis stuff, which we might talk about later on in the class, but getting people to sort of delve deep and recall things that had happened in their past that they never thought of. And that leads to a lot of false memories and misremembering, which we'll talk about later on in the course. But of course, so for our criticisms here, our behaviorists, those ones who focus on the external influences and the fact that we learn from interacting with our environment and sort of behaving as we've interacted with things, they really, really hated this reliance on conscious mental processes to explain behavior, because they were focusing on, we're doing things because of only our consciousness, whether it be things that we're actively aware of or not actively aware of, but it's all to do with the mind, nothing to do with the environment. So the exact opposite of behaviorism. They especially hated the idea of unconscious processes being involved, because to them that was something that had no way of being accurately quantified or talked about in order to describe how it's influencing behavior. So they were against pretty much every part of the psychodynamic view. With cognitive psychologists and even more modern psychodynamic psychologists, they really dislike some aspects of the original theory, as we've kind of hinted at already. So that focus on unconscious sexual and aggressive urges, that was a big Freud thing that has since been dropped. Modern day psychodynamic perspective, though it still has a little bit of a stigma associated with it, they still care about things that are unconscious, and they might still care about our childhood, but not to the point that they go hunting for repressed things related to sex and aggression the way that Freud would have. So it has come quite a long way, though they still care about sort of conscious awareness and unconscious awareness. It's a little bit less controversial as it had been in the past. And that is a nice way to transition over to our cognitive view. So this would be in contrast to the psychodynamic view, where Instead of having sort of those three distinct sections, the cognitive view focused on only two, our conscious and unconscious, and viewed them as complementary or partnered ways of processing information. So with the cognitive view, we would be sort of processing things that we're aware of. Maybe we're trying to solve problems and we're working on it actively in our mind. Maybe we're doing mental math or trying to plot a route in our head. But our unconscious, the stuff in the background, might also be working on this problem. We're just not focusing on it. So instead of saying conscious versus unconscious, they more go with the division of controlled or effortful versus automatic processing. So the controlled or effortful processing would be the stuff that we are intentionally trying to focus on. Something that is voluntary, something that we're choosing to do, and it's going to be taking attention and focus. So this would be a slow but flexible approach. We have automatic processing, which, as the name would apply, occurs automatically with no conscious involvement. This is when you're doing stuff on autopilot. So we have minimal conscious processing. We can rely on the fact that we already know how to walk. So we don't focus on putting one foot in front of the other. We have that muscle memory. We know what we're doing. I always use the example of going up and down stairs. You're fine going up or down the stairs until you think about it. As soon as you reintroduce that consciousness, you are a lot more likely to take a misstep and fall. So we rely on automatic processing because it's going to happen in a very structured, rigid way. Very, very fast, but comes with the issue of being static. So if we encountered a step that is much larger or much smaller than all of the other steps that we've already taken, we might trip up a little bit because it's different and we're not prepared to handle that change. But our effortful processing or controlled processing, it takes more conscious effort, it takes more involvement, but allows us to be adaptive. Another great example of this is if you drive, or I guess even ride a bike. If you take the same route to and from school every day, then you can kind of do it on autopilot. You don't have to think a lot about it. You might even find that you pull into the parking lot and go, wait a second, how did I get here? You drove fine, you didn't break any laws, you followed the rules of the road, but you weren't aware of what was going on. Your brain just sort of ran it in the background. But if you had to stop and face traffic or construction and take a detour, you couldn't rely on that automatic processing. You have to focus in on your controlled processing so that you could choose a route and think about where you are and where you need to go and change it out.
Would that be muscle memory?
Yeah, very similar. It isn't necessarily like mutually exclusive, but it can involve muscle memory. And when we start talking about sort of different aspects of memory, like with muscle memory, that's a lot of stuff through like our cerebellum, and other kinds of processing aren't necessarily through the cerebellum, but they do the same basic function for this cognitive perspective. Because we could also have automatic processing with things like doing math problems. So maybe you've done tons and tons of algebra problems, and you're fine until you're faced with a symbol you've never seen before, and you have to stop and take a look at it, or something like that. So we can have automatic and controlled processing for all sorts of different aspects of our lives, which is very cool. And so we can think about, again, pros and cons there, slow but flexible, or fast but static. So if you were asked sort of which would be the better to use in a particular situation, it would really depend on that situation and what you need out of it. So if you're fine with a rote response that's always the same, then automatic processing is fine. But if you're ever faced with something slightly different, if you're ever faced with changing situations, then you're going to have to go with effortful processing. All right. And that brings us to our next section. This is sort of a nice transition here into awareness and attention. And I think I might have mentioned it earlier, but I always forget the section on awareness and attention, which seems ironic, but for 3 years, I have done this section as a standalone because I always forget to include it in this chapter. So for the first time in a long time, I'm doing it all at once, which feels really nice. Because it does. It fits very nicely with what we were just talking about in terms of attention. And so if we start looking again, we're going to have some vague definitions, but we can focus on awareness as the ability to directly know and perceive, to feel, or be cognizant of different events. So awareness is fairly close to attention. With attention, we'll find it as being a little bit more focused. I found it interesting. I went and grabbed some definitions from either Wikipedia or the Encyclopedia Britannica for the next couple of things. And this just highlights the fact that in this particular topic, the definitions are not necessarily helpful, and they tend to be very circular. So we'll see attention, awareness, and consciousness all used fairly interchangeably. So the Wikipedia definition of awareness is the state of being conscious of something. Yeah, which gets even better when we hop over to attention, and attention is the concentration of our awareness on some phenomenon, but specifically here to the exclusion of other stimuli. This is where we're finally getting into something. Yeah, we're still using awareness in here, but we're talking about focusing or directing our attention, so focusing that awareness onto one aspect of our environment while specifically excluding other aspects. So this kind of makes sense. We don't have infinite mental resources. We can only focus on so many things at a time. If you think of, maybe you get a text in the middle of class and you want to check your phone, but reading the text interferes with your ability to listen to the lecture. You're using very similar mental resources, and you can't get meaning from both sources of information. So you kind of have to pick one or the other. So that would be our attention. What do you focus on? What do you sort of pay attention to? Do you wait and read the text later? Or do you say, oh, I'll figure out the lecture in a little bit, I'll catch up in a moment? So you have to make that decision of where you're directing your attention and what you're focusing on. And it's not to say that we're not capable of dividing our attention. It is actually fairly adaptive to be able to divide our attention, to do multiple things at once. Maybe you would like to walk between classes and carry on a conversation. You can do both things. Again, relying a little bit on that automatic versus effortful processing, but we do have enough resources that we can do multiple things. But we run into these difficulties if the tasks end up requiring similar resources. So that whole getting meaning from written word versus spoken word, that's using the same part of the brain, so you can't really do both at once. We also have to keep in mind that the more we divide our attention, the longer it might take us to switch back to that effortful processing to make a conscious decision to do something. So the big example that all textbooks will use is cell phone use and driving, where if you have your cell phone while you're driving, it takes a lot longer to register changes on the road because your attention is divided. And this is really interesting. I've done some, I've taught some classes alongside Anthony Singhal at the U of A. I was his TA for a couple of semesters, but he did a bunch of research looking at sort of distracted driving. I believe they did it in a VR environment, but I can't remember now. It's been quite a few years. But he was one of the people who was showing that it's not just being physically on your phone and holding it, but even talking to someone on the phone, even with hands-free, if they're not in the car, they can be a distraction too. And this is a little bit more than you need, but it's really cool, so I'm going to talk about it anyways. But the reasoning here is that someone who's in the car with you, if you're driving and you have a passenger, if something's happening on the road, maybe a pedestrian jumps out, your passenger might react to that. They might stop talking so that you can deal with upcoming traffic, or something along those lines. They're going to add to the situation, not continue to distract you. Unless it's like driving with my grandmother, who does not stop for the environment. But when you're on the phone with someone, they can't see what's going on. So they might keep talking through a situation, and you might then have to spend resources to block them out to focus on what's going on. And so it's not so much holding the phone itself that's problematic, it's the fact that you're dividing your attention that causes problems. And I always find it interesting because Especially when I was younger, cell phones were just becoming a thing, and they started making laws of distracted driving. So you couldn't have cell phones out, but you could do the hands-free. And they didn't realize why they weren't seeing a really good drop-off in accidents associated with cell phone use. And it's because it wasn't the physical cell phones themselves, it was the attention dividing, which is very interesting. So one of those very cool aspects to consider. And so then if we want to talk about directing our attention, so we've kind of mentioned it as something that happens, but not really how. Directing our attention can be either conscious or unconscious. Again, we kind of have this binary of it's something we're aware of or it's something we're unaware of. But if it's a conscious process, then maybe you choose to pay attention to something. Maybe I'm talking about a topic that you already know really well, so maybe you want to check your emails. You made a conscious decision to focus on something else. But it can also be an unconscious process. There are certain stimuli that we are biologically predisposed to pay attention to that will forcibly grab our attention. So if you think of emergency vehicles, if an ambulance or fire truck drives by, between the loud noise, the sudden movement, the bright colors, the flashing lights, all of that is designed to get your attention. So that would be something that's unconscious. It's going to grab your attention automatically and force your focus elsewhere. And it doesn't have to be stuff that's designed to grab our attention. We might notice other things. I think I have a couple of slides for it, but we notice things like attractive faces in the crowd, or even angry voices. That's something that will draw our attention because it's biologically relevant. We'll come back to some other things that are good at grabbing attention later. Instead of just focusing on visual attention, we might do something like auditory attention. So we could use a process like shadowing, which is where they get you to listen to different things and see if you can focus on multiple things at a time. So the standard setup here is you have headphones, and the left one plays one type of sound and the right one plays a different kind of sound. So here on one side it would have different kinds of birds, and on the other side it would be listing different kinds of weather. And then they would say, okay, repeat only what you hear on the right, or repeat only what you hear on the left. And then after you've done that, after you've focused on repeating what you've heard, they could ask you, what was the other side playing? Well, you didn't have enough attention, you didn't have enough focus to listen to both, so you might have no idea what was going on the other side because you excluded that stimulus in order to listen to these. So that's that focusing on one thing at the exclusion of others. And then the next thing here, I actually don't know if this is going to work in class, but I want to try it. So this is an awareness test. I don't think we have audio because I don't want to try and mess with my computer. But I believe it also shows text. Yeah, perfect. So how many passes does the team in white make? So see if you can count how many passes are made. Then you watch it again, focusing on something else. That is one of my favorite clips to be able to show in person. And there were a bunch of these that were put out. For this one, this was, focus on things that you might not be attending to. It's really easy to miss things. But there are quite a few ads that have done something similar to this. I've also seen one with a person in a gorilla suit. It's usually people either playing soccer or basketball or hockey, and they ask you to count something that involves most of your mental processes. But it's kind of neat how much we can end up missing. So this concept, this missing something that should have potentially been blatantly obvious, is called inattention blindness or inattentional blindness. And that's the idea that if you're not focusing on something, it's still going to register on your nervous system, so it means that you're still capable of sensing it, so your eyes weren't blinded to the presence of that bear. but you weren't focusing on it, you weren't paying attention to it, so it never actually entered into your consciousness. So you still saw it, but you weren't aware that you saw it until your attention was shifted. So a lot of times when we didn't see something, it's not because it wasn't there, but it's because we weren't focusing in on it. And so this is why it's interesting to do things like rewatch movies that you've seen before. A lot of horror movies do things in the background that are meant to kind of throw you off because you're not quite aware of something off. But then when you focus on it later on, you know exactly why you felt weird. So there's lots of ways that you can harness this inattention blindness. A lot of things like street magic would be doing this by getting you to focus on one thing and distracting you. They can do something else that you were unaware of, not because you didn't see it, but because you didn't register that you saw it. There's been, actually, we still have some time, so I can talk about a couple of other really cool examples that they've done with this, because they really like this concept and the fact that it's kind of neat to show people. So they've done it with radiologists, and they'll show them a bunch of x-rays, but if you manipulate those x-rays to actually have images in them, so again, they've done images of gorillas or robots, and the x-ray technicians are so focused on the aspects of an x-ray that matter to them, maybe broken bones or particular densities of tissue, that they completely ignore the larger picture and don't realize that it's a gorilla. So it's kind of neat to see stuff like that. Another one, not as fun, was looking at pilots in a VR simulation. And so they had pilots who were so focused in on their instruments during these simulated flights that they completely missed the fact that there were already other planes on the runway they were trying to land on. So again, they don't necessarily have enough attention, enough focus to pay attention to everything. So they would focus on the fact that yes, there's a runway coming up, but they didn't look at what was on that runway. So fortunately, this is part of the testing process where they can figure out what do we need to make people aware of, what do we need to get pilots to check for before they land. All right, and then we can come to our factors that influence attention. I already kind of talked about some of these, but the nature of the stimulus that's maybe grabbing our attention or not is definitely going to affect whether we pay attention to it or not. So we are predisposed to pay attention to things that are novel. So if we've never seen it before, it's new to us, it's going to be a lot more attention grabbing. So if you think of a new billboard that's gone up in your neighborhood, you've never seen it before, so the first day you notice it, you're going to look at it, you're going to read it, see what it's for. But by the time it's been there for a week, maybe you don't care. You completely ignore it now. You've seen it, nothing new. Things that are moving or very intense, those tend to draw our attention. We are really good at perceiving when stuff is coming at us. And our brain is actually capable of processing if it's going to hit us or not. And we react slower to things that aren't going to hit us. So that's, if you think of the famous video of someone throwing a shoe at President Bush, and Bush ducks immediately, but the guy standing next to him ducks almost like 5 seconds late. He had a very slow reaction time, and that's because the shoe was on target to hit the president, but not the guy standing next to him. So it used a different pathway in his brain, and he didn't have to respond as quickly. We notice things that are repetitive. We tend to find them annoying, so beeping. If it's consistent, that would start driving us nuts. Mainly things that are in contrast to their surroundings. And we've already talked about the fact that we pay attention to things that are new in our environment. So we tend to be more aware of things that have changed or things that are in the process of changing. We might also have some biological or personal significance or relevance of a stimulus, and we'll talk about some examples of that. Our current internal state can have a massive impact on what we pay attention to. If you're hungry and you walk past a Subway sandwich shop and you smell that bread, you are very aware of it. But if you just had a massive meal and you're very full, then the smell isn't as appealing. If you're really tired, you might not be sensitive to any cues because you're focused inward on how tired you're feeling. So our internal state can have a pretty big impact. Personal motivation and interest is also another good one. Someone who studies plants will be aware of plants where they go. I study birds, so I am very quick to point out different species of birds that I either see or hear. So my personal motivation and interest determines what I find most salient or most attention-grabbing in a situation. We can also have personal experiences, so whatever you're used to. So I like the example of if you've played lots of Super Mario. Maybe you know the particular there's a particular block that looks conspicuous because it's not near other blocks, so you know it's probably some kind of hidden passageway. So you become attuned to different cues that somebody else might not notice. And I already kind of mentioned some of the stuff that will attract our attention. So we will notice an attractive face in the crowd. That makes sense biologically. Picking up anger or fear on a face, whether it's sort of visual or auditory, we're going to notice that because someone who's afraid is probably afraid of something that matters to us. And someone who's angry might be a threat to us, so we'd care about that. We are good at the moving stimuli thing, and we can detect paths. We already did that. And then we have this really interesting aspect that I kind of hinted at with our description of rods versus cones, where our peripheral attention, we have sort of detailed, focused images on our fovea, but in our periphery, we don't have very good detail. We're really good at movement and identifying, say, silhouetted things. We're really good at focusing on things that are biologically relevant. Like if there's a bear in our periphery, we'd notice that and shift our attention. But it's like our brains are aware that our cones aren't great at detail, so they're really good at picking out things that are worth being brought to our attention. So again, things that move, things that are biologically relevant in shape that might be a threat, sort of things that should have our attention focused on them. So we can then have a very rapid shift so that we then focus our detail and our focal point on those things that had been in our periphery. And that was what I wanted to get through today. We are perfect on timing, but I hope you found this interesting. We're going to finish off the rest of this chapter, probably not Friday. We'll finish on Monday next week, but we're getting there.